In biology, a common name of a taxon or organism is a name that is based on the normal language of everyday life. This kind of name is often contrasted with the scientific name for the same organism, which is Latinized. A so-called common name is sometimes quite frequently used, but that is not always the case. Sometimes common names are created by authorities on one particular subject, in an attempt to make it possible for members of the general public to be able to refer to one particular species of organism without needing to be able to memorize or pronounce the Latinized scientific name. Creating an official list of common names can also be an attempt to standardize the use of common names, which can sometimes vary a great deal between one part of a country and another, as well as between one country and another country, even where the same language is spoken in both places. Use as part of folk taxonomy. A common name intrinsically plays a part in a classification of objects, typically an incomplete and informal classification, in which some names are degenerate examples in that they are unique and lack reference to any other name, as is the case with, say, ginkgo, okapi, and rattle. Folk taxonomy, which is a classification of objects using common names, has no formal rules and need not be consistent or logical in its assignment of names, so that, say, not all flies are called flies and not every animal called a fly is indeed a fly. In contrast, scientific or biological nomenclature is a global system that attempts to denote particular organisms or taxa uniquely and definitively, on the assumption that such organisms or taxa are well-defined and generally also have well-defined interrelationships. Accordingly, the ICZN has formal rules for biological nomenclature and convenes periodic international meetings to further that purpose. Common names and the binomial system. The form of scientific names for organisms that is called binomial nomenclature is quite similar to the noun-adjective form of vernacular names or common names that were used by prehistoric cultures. A collective name such as owl was made more specific by the addition of an adjective such as screech. Linnaeus himself published a flora of his homeland Sweden, Flora Sversica, and in this he recorded the Swedish common names, region by region, as well as the scientific names. The Swedish common names were all binomials. The vernacular binomial system thus preceded his scientific binomial system. Linnean authority William T. Stern said, by the introduction of his binomial system of nomenclature, Linnaeus gave plants and animals an essentially Latin nomenclature like vernacular nomenclature in style but linked to published, and hence relatively stable and verifiable, scientific concepts and thus suitable for international use. Geographic range of use. The geographic range over which a particular common name is used varies. Some common names have a very local application, while others are virtually universal within a particular language. Some such names even apply across ranges of languages. The word for cat, for instance, is easily recognizable in most Germanic and many Romance languages. Many vernacular names, however, are restricted to a single country, and colloquial names to local districts. Constraints and problems. Common names are used in the writings of both professionals and laymen. Lay people sometimes object to the use of scientific names over common names, but the use of scientific names can be defended, as it is in these remarks from a book on marine fish. Because, as already remarked, common names often have a very local distribution. We find that the same fish in a single area may have several common names. Because of ignorance of relevant biological facts among the lay public, a single species of fish might have several extra common names. Because individuals in the species differ according to maturity, gender, or as a response to their natural surroundings, i.e., ecophenotypic variation. In contrast to common names, formal, taxonomic names imply biological relationships between similarly named creatures. Because of incidental events, contact with other languages, or simple confusion, common names in a given region sometimes change with time. In a book that lists over 1,200 species of fishes, more than half have no widely recognized common name. They either are too nondescript or too rarely seen to have earned any widely accepted common name. Conversely, a single common name often applies to multiple species of fishes. The lay public might simply not recognize or care about subtle differences in appearance between only very distantly related species. Many species that are rare or lack economic importance do not have a common name. Coining common names. In scientific binomial nomenclature, names commonly are derived from classical or modern Latin or Greek or Latinized forms of vernacular words or coinages. Such names generally are difficult for laymen to learn, remember, and pronounce, and so, in such books as field guides, biologists commonly publish lists of coined common names. Many examples of such common names simply are attempts to translate the Latinized name into English or some other vernacular. Such translation may be confusing in itself, or confusingly inaccurate. For example, graciosus does not mean gracile, and gracilis does not mean graceful. The practice of coining common names has long been discouraged. The Candoll's Laws of Botanical Nomenclature, 1868. The non-binding recommendations that form the basis of the modern International Code of Nomenclature for Algae, Fungi, and Plants contains the following. Art. 68. Every friend of science ought to be opposed to the introduction into a modern language of names of plants that are not already there, unless they are derived from a Latin botanical name that has undergone but a slight alteration, or the fabrication of names termed vulgar names, totally different from Latin ones, to be prescribed. The public to whom they are addressed derive no advantage from them, because they are novelties. Lindley's work, The Vegetable Kingdom, would have been better relished in England had not the author introduced into it so many new English names that are to be found in no dictionary, and that do not preclude the necessity of learning with what Latin names they are synonymous. A tolerable idea may be given of the danger of too great a multiplicity of vulgar names, by imagining what geography would be, or, for instance, the post office administration, supposing every town had a totally different name in every language. Various bodies, and the authors of many technical and semi-technical books, do not simply adapt existing common names for various organisms. They try to coin comprehensive, useful, authoritative, and standardized lists of new names. The purpose typically is to create names from scratch where no common names exist, to impose a particular choice of name where there is more than one common name, to improve existing common names, to replace them with names that conform more to the relatedness of the organisms. Other attempts to reconcile differences between widely separated regions, traditions and languages, by arbitrarily imposing nomenclature, often reflect narrow perspectives and have unfortunate outcomes. For example, members of the genus Berhinus occur in Australia, Southern Africa, Eurasia, and South America. A recent trend in field manuals and bird lists is to use the name thick-knee for members of the genus. This, in spite of the fact that the majority of the species occur in non-English speaking regions and have various common names, not always English. For example, Dicap is the centuries-old South African vernacular name for their two local species. Berhinus capensis is the Cape dicap. Berhinus vermiculatus is the water dicap. The thick joints in question are not even in fact the bird's knees, but the intertarsal joints, in lay terms the ankles. Furthermore, not all species in the genus have thick knees, so the thickness of the knees of some species is not of clearly descriptive significance. The family Berhinidae has members that have various common names even in English, including stone curlews. So the choice of the name of thick knees is not easy to defend, but is a clear illustration of the hazards of facile coinage of terminology. Lists that include common names. Lists are general interest collective nouns for various subjects. See List of collective nouns. Official lists. Some organizations have created official lists of common names, or guidelines for creating common names, hoping to standardize the use of common names. For example, the Australian Fish Names List, or AFNS, was compiled through a process involving work by taxonomic and seafood industry experts, drafted using the CAAB taxon management system of the CSIRO, and including input through public and industry consultations by the Australian Fish Names Committee. The AFNS has been an official Australian standard since July 2007 and has existed in draft form since 2001. Seafood Services Australia serve as the secretariat for the AFNC. SSA is an accredited Standards Australia standards development. A set of guidelines for the creation of English names for birds was published in the AUK in 1978. It gave rise to Birds of the World, recommended English names and its Spanish and French companions. Bibliography. Stern, William T. The background of Linnaeus's contributions to the nomenclature and methods of systematic biology. Systematic Zoology 8. 4-22.